Hi, my name is Karen Anderson. I'm Chief of Staff for the President's Council of Economic Advisors here at the White House. I'm here with Austan Goolsbee, who is a Senior Economic Advisor to the President and a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. Austin's going to start off by giving us a general overview of the economy, and then we'll take questions from those of you in the audience.
Well, you know, we've been paying a lot of attention to the economy lately, and I happen to have here with me from the Council of Economic Advisors the economic indicators for August of 2009. The job market obviously still remains in a tough spot, but across the board, in virtually every area, the conditions came in far better than what was expected. So in industrial production, in core capital goods, in consumer spending, in hourly earnings, even in employment, consumer confidence, in all of those areas, they came in better than expectations. You've started to see some glimmers of hope in the first improvements that we've seen in some months, because it's been a very, very tough period. But we're happy to answer any questions. Karen, did anybody send in a question?
All right, well, we're a little slow getting started here, but there was one question about whether we should have concerns about deflation or inflation. Is that something that you can discuss as we're entering our recovery?
Well, yeah, a lot of that has to do with monetary policy and the Fed, but we've been very concerned about the issue of deflation because we have a lot of tools in the toolkit to deal with inflation if you start to see it. When you start facing deflation, as they last did in a serious way during the Depression, there's not a whole lot you can do. So we, with the Recovery Act and with the stimulus, we're trying to put as much money into the economy and prevent falling off a cliff. The good news is the data from the economic indicators and the last several months suggest that we and the Fed together did avoid that precipice, and so hopefully there's not as big a risk of deflation, but we've certainly been concerned about that. Inflation, we've seen very little sign of it thus far. That's more of a long-run phenomenon, and the President has talked about we want to have an exit strategy and get out of all of the emergency measures we've had to do as soon as we're out of the woods.
Great. We have another question just, Austan, how long do you think it'll be before the unemployment numbers improve?
Well, I try to stay out of the forecasting business because I'm not necessarily very good at it, but I have no reason to doubt the blue chip indicators of the top 50 forecasters or any of the other private forecasters who are saying the unemployment rate's probably going to peak above 10%, and that might be end of this year, beginning of next year, something like that. The job market remains, as I say, in a tough spot. Historically, it always lags the economy. So when you turn the economy around, then it takes some time before it starts generating jobs. But President every day is always focused. Whenever he sees any of the economic advisors, one of the first things he's asking is, what are we doing on jobs? What are we doing about unemployment? What are we doing to create new jobs? And so I think we're likely to see continued focus on that.
Okay. We have a question about healthcare reform, a number of questions about healthcare reform. But do you think health insurance reform will have a positive or negative impact on the economy or economic growth?
If you do it right, the great hope is that it would have a positive impact on the economy. And I would refer everyone to the Council of Economic Advisors reports on the subject of what would fundamental health reform do for the economy in the short run and the long run. And they put out a pretty detailed report. I think the onus will be on the administration to make sure that we do the health reform right. And the President, I think, is committed to do that. The key aspect is getting the cost down, because right now we're in a system where the status quo is busted. Just continuing of what we're doing now, where you've got millions of people over time losing their private health insurance and costs being crippled, the businesses being crippled by the cost, especially small businesses not being able to afford to provide health insurance to almost a majority of small business employees. In a world like that, if you can get the cost down, you can have, I think, a pretty positive impact. There's more on health?
Well, I think that's a great one, and we could move over to banks. There are a number of questions about banks and what type of lending we're going to see starting up in the banks, and do you have a concern about risky lending starting back up?
Well, some concern, I mean, I think the bigger concern right now is we need more lending. You know, if you look at small business credit, small businesses have been feeling a big pinch. They've had their lines of credit cut. The normal channel of recovery, a lot of that channel goes through small business and startup firms, and they've had a tough time getting credit. So the administration's been trying in a lot of different ways to facilitate more credit going to small business. Certainly, we want to be mindful of excessively risky lending. I would call it of the form that we saw of the last few years before the crisis. And there, I think the onus is going to be more on the president's financial regulatory reform agenda, that we reform the regulatory apparatus so that the kind of fly-by-night, make-a-quick-buck operators that took advantage of consumers weren't protected. In a circumstance like that, we want to avoid that part of the lending, but we want to encourage lending for small business owners, for example, to take a risk. So I think we're trying to stress that balance.
Super. Can you address also, Austan, some concerns we're seeing here about the expanding deficit and how that could impact the economy going down the road?
Okay, look, everybody's concerned about the long-run fiscal position facing the country, for sure. One thing that I want everybody to recognize is when you're in the midst of the stiffest recession since 1929, that is not the time to tighten the belt. If you hear anybody saying, yeah, we ought to just cancel the recovery package because that's increasing the deficit this year, that's totally wrong. And you got to be totally sure that we're out of the woods before we start talking about that. Now, once we're out of the woods, if you look at the deficit, the primary reason that the deficit over the next 10 years has gotten worse is because the economy is so much worse. So our number one priority is get the economy growing again, because that will have a major positive impact on revenues coming in. But the second thing I'd point out is there is a significant chunk of the increase in the deficit that has only to do with the president being committed to tell the truth and get rid of the budget gimmicks. So if you look back for many years in Washington, they played games like put in $0 for expected spending on natural disasters. Even though there's a hurricane season every year, for budgetary terms, in some sense, they come in and say, oh my goodness, look, we never could have predicted there would be a hurricane in Florida this year, and then they come up with the money to pay for it. And Obama said, look, that doesn't make any sense. We know there's going to be an average amount of expenses on natural disasters. Let's admit that and put it in the budget. There are things that are temporary, stated to be temporary, so they don't count, but every year they just get extended. And so Obama said, let's get rid of all the budget gimmicks that we can and be honest about that. And if you look at those two things, those have really been driving the numbers higher. And I think we've got to focus on making the government efficient and have discipline in what our programs are, but we've also got to try and juice the growth rate, because those two things make a big impact.
And we actually have another question specifically about the role of health insurance reform in reducing the deficit. Do you want to just touch on that again quickly?
Okay, with healthcare, the most important thing to realize about healthcare is that its impact on the budget of the government tends to be long run in nature, because the growth rate of healthcare costs is taking place slowly. It's getting wider and wider above the rate of inflation, and the population is aging a little bit more each year. So as you look out 10, 20, 30 years down the road, that the inflation rate of healthcare costs suddenly looms as the single most important issue facing the fiscal situation of the government, as well as the fiscal, as your own personal budget, and the most important issue facing businesses in terms of their cost. So the imperative is to try to slow down the increase in costs and make it more affordable. And doing that helps ordinary people afford to pay their bills, but also really helps the government's finances.
Well, an issue that you have a lot of expertise in, that we're getting a number of questions on, is tax reform. Can you speak a little bit to what the administration is thinking in terms of tax reform coming down the road?
Well, the administration hasn't put forward any official tax reform position. The president, through the campaign and to this day, believes that over the 2000s, you saw ordinary income Americans, the middle sort of 80% of the country, squeezed like never before, with their income stagnant and the cost of health care, of energy, of a bunch of stuff going up. And so in the recovery package, he cut taxes for 95% of workers. And his view was, in the 2000s, we could not afford, and nor should we have, spent trillions of dollars cutting taxes for the very highest income Americans, say making more than $250,000 a year, or in many cases even above that. So we ought to just let the rates go back to what they were in the 90s under Bill Clinton, when those rate changes expire in 2011. Separate from that, the president asked his Economic Recovery Advisory Board, which I serve as the chief economist for, he asked that group, which is headed by Paul Volcker, to come up with options about ways to reform the tax system. And so they have been gathering lots of information on that, and they should be coming out with a report to help inform the administration, Congress. These are outsiders, they're not in the administration, but they should be coming up with, some options.
Great. Well, another area where you have a lot of expertise is the home buyer's credit, and questions about whether that could potentially be extended, and if it could be extended not just to first-time home buyers, but to other homeowners as well.
This is a complex issue, and I have no legislative expertise, and if I started telling you about congressional legislative probabilities, somebody would probably come in here and yank me out with the hook. All I will say is, we're aware of this issue. There's a great effort within the administration to try to gather the data to see what impact has this had, how beneficial has it been. And I know that in Congress, they are looking at evidence like that and debating if this had a good bang for the buck, ought we to extend it, and ought we to consider targeting it or broadening it to different kinds of people.
Also, some curiosity here on what might be happening with Social Security reform.
Social Security reform, the president has said, the aging of the population is certainly a major fiscal issue facing the country over the long term, and facing every individual person's retirement security in an environment where, the stock market went way up and then plunged by a lot, and people looked at their 401k and it's down, 30, 40%. I think a lot of people are really concerned about their retirement security. The president has always said we ought to gather the best ideas that we can, that you really can't address these key issues like Social Security in any way other than gathering everybody around the table and getting the best ideas. There haven't been any specific proposals or anything on that, but the president's open to looking at all different ways to strengthen our retirement.
Thank you. Okay, some questions about just how to increase domestic production, bring jobs back to the United States, and make sure we're competitive on an international, global level. I know that's a big area to cover,
each
but
one of those is huge. Okay, look, the first step, and I think it's the step everybody felt, when we got into this crisis, which is, are we going to be okay? And the evidence that's coming in the economic indicators now suggests we're getting closer to okay. We're on the road to okay, and that's where we want to be. Getting production up in the U.S. is really important, not just for the economy. We don't just care about, what's the GDP growth rate. If you want to generate jobs, you got to generate production, and you got to have economic activity going on here in this country. The president's been committed to let's find a way to do that that's not just going back to a bubble and bust cycle. So we don't want to just reinvent some new bubble that we can invest in as a way to get us out of that. We want to invest in things that, they have a long-term payoff. And that's investing in the, education and skill of our workforce. It also means investing and giving a level playing field and a chance for our domestic industries to succeed. And I think you see with the recovery package, we put a lot of attention in to getting U.S. industry up off the floor, and it has helped do that in a number of areas, and hopefully that will continue to improve. What was the second part? Competitiveness. Okay, the competitiveness of U.S. industry hinges greatly on our capacity for innovation. Everybody knows the U.S. has been the greatest innovative nation in the world. We have the leading scientists, we've had the leading education system, we've had the leading applying of science and technology to business, and we've had the greatest entrepreneurial spirit of any place. When you're in an environment like this, where it's hard for entrepreneurs to get finance, where states and cities and universities and the government are all tempted, they say, we got to tighten our belt, let's cut back on our spending on innovation and technology. We got to fight back against that. The key to competitiveness is for us to invest in the knowledge base of this country. And the president has been really firmly committed to that, to putting us on kind of an innovation agenda.
All right, well, this is going to be a bit of a tough question, but we've had so much interest that I think folks are going to be upset if you don't address this. No. But can you talk a little bit about the role of green jobs and green growth in the stimulus package and the administration's focus on that area?
Who asked? It depends what they mean. Look, the president believes that you have the chance of a twofer of generating jobs, getting the economy growing, and helping the environment, helping end our dependence on foreign oil with its national security implications, etc. That we could do those two things together if we're smart about it. And so in the recovery package, we had a number of specific proposals. In the broader energy strategy and environmental strategy that the president is outlining, a lot of it is geared around that. And I think when you start thinking about, well, what could people do? How can we generate jobs in a way that's not just digging a hole and filling a hole? A lot of people say, well, there are a bunch of environmental things, be they weatherization or putting insulation in people's homes or environmental cleanup or a whole bunch of things like that. And the president's tried to enable the private sector to get moving in that area. And I think if you start looking in this in detail, there's some pretty interesting approaches they've taken.
Great. I think we have time for just one or two more questions here. In terms of small businesses, what types of programs are being put in place to help small businesses get loans?
That's a super important question, and as we were just talking about, normally in a recovery, one of the big drivers of job growth is new companies and small businesses expanding. In this environment where the banks are not lending and we're in a credit crunch, this important channel has kind of been plugged up, and so the administration has been trying to unleash that. It's done that in a series of, maybe you'd call them technical moves, but they're various financial things to try to get small business credits, small business securitization of small business loans, and applying sometimes public pressure, sometimes public carrots to get small community banks, regional banks, and medium-sized banks who have historically been big sources of credit for small business, get them back out in the game lending and not afraid the way they have been for, over the past year since Lehman collapsed, really. You've seen some success, but we need more. The president is not satisfied with what's happened. He's very concerned about the role of small business, and we've been pushing on credit to small business in a whole bunch of areas.
Well, I'm going to give you the last question, Austin, if that's okay, which is, since we have such some positive economic indicators, when do you see things turning around in the economy? Do you have a general sense?
Well, as the president came into office, if you remember, most forecasters were saying they hoped that there would be positive growth by the end of 2009, but they weren't sure if that would happen. Now you've got the blue chip forecasters, this average of 50 major forecasters, saying that the third quarter alone, they're upward revising what they think that the growth will be fairly substantially positive in the 2 to 3% range in the third quarter. And hopefully it would go up further in the fourth quarter and going into next year. So hopefully the private sector forecasters are right, and we're going to start seeing that rebound. On the job market, I think it's much tougher. It tends to lag when the economy turns around. The unemployment rate is unacceptably high, and it's probably going to get even higher as you go to the end of this year and into next year. But hopefully, as we go to next year, we'll start seeing the economy generating jobs. And once we generate jobs and people who got bumped down to part-time moving back to full-time, we can get the unemployment rate down and stick on this trajectory, which has been very positive. The last couple months, we're definitely going in the right direction, and we just need to put the pedal to the metal.
Super. Well, thank you very much. It's very
Thank you,
informative.
Karen.